Story 1. I was counseling a 13-year-old girl for anxiety, and she reported sexual abuse from her stepdad. I called her mom and told her mother I needed to call Child Protective Services. It turns out that Child Protective Services was already aware, and the abuse was first reported around the patient's age of 7. Her mom was aware of the abuse and stayed with her husband anyway. It was a complicated situation, and it wasn't. How could she not do more to protect her daughter? Sorry, lady, I'm judging. Story 2. My professor once shared what a patient said that made her quit her job. I didn't rape my daughter. She liked it. The daughter was 6. She couldn't take it anymore. She worked in a rehabilitation center for people who have been sentenced for serious crimes and were forced to get mental help. It was a really difficult job, and this pushed her over the edge. Story 3. I work at a residential group home. We had a child who we had admitted about 4 months prior when, in a family session, they mentioned they had parasites. I'm like, what? Mom goes, oh yeah, our whole family has them. We don't believe in getting rid of them since they're part of our biological ecosystem. I'm just dumbstruck. We spent 3 weeks afterward convincing this family it was an infectious disease concern, as other residents have fecal eating behaviors and various other unsanitary issues that could cause a unit spread. 3 weeks of education, planning, and worst of all, convincing this child and mother that their intelligence quotient wouldn't drop because they had agreed to eradicate the parasites. Lots of cognitive behavioral therapy work, but it took way longer than any of my team expected. Story 4. Once, I had a patient whose wife shook their baby to death. He wanted help reconnecting with his wife. At the time, I was a young father of a newborn myself, and he triggered a lot of fear in me for my own child, a deep loathing of his spouse, and pity for the patient. I tried for 3 sessions, met his spouse and everything, before handing the case over to my supervisor, who knew about my initial reactions and tried to help me through it. Unfortunately, it ended up being more about my feelings than his, and I was new to the profession at the time. These things are expected to crop up from time to time, but I was still taken aback by my own reactions. Story 5. I do acute pediatric inpatient behavioral therapy. It has never happened with a child, and it never will. Parents, on the other hand, can be real pieces of it, and the way they treat or abuse their children then throw them off on us and scream, "Fix them." I'm a big, burly guy, and I've cried many nights over this. Story 6. I work with children who have experienced some kind of abuse or trauma. 90% of my clients have been sexually abused. I have a lot of shocking moments, but not from judgment of my clients, rather from what happened to them. I have had clients whose father made them help him dismember their mother's body after he murdered her in front of them. I have had clients under the age of 8 who have been sex trafficked. I have had clients who have been forced to film torture pornography. I have shocking moments all the time. Story 7. I was once in my psychiatrist's office, a bi-monthly, 15-minute medication check. She asked me what was going on, more as conversation. I told her that in the last 6 weeks, my 3 elders, an aunt and 2 uncles, for whom I was the guardian and conservator, had died, one right after the other. My wife had a heart attack. My daughter attempted suicide. And my mom broke her hip and had laid on her floor for a week before being found. She drank and ate from the dog's bowls. I got that call within 10 minutes of setting up the last funeral. She stopped the meeting, got on the phone with a therapist in the office next to her, and had her postpone her next meeting to speak with me. I was so messed up, I had no idea. I think she saved my life. Story 8. It's not often I get to talk about my profession, but here goes. I was working at a drug and alcohol rehabilitation center and had a client come in who was a self-proclaimed drug lord. As we worked together, he told me about his history, including how he got to where he was currently. During the conversation, this man admitted to selling his sister into sex slavery, forcibly injecting her with several sedatives and narcotics, and having several people teach her a lesson. What this meant, he never shared. He told the story with a blank face, smiling only when he recalled the good times, which he referred to as times when he had enough heroin to get through the day. I'm not sure where he is now, but this man inspired me to work with victims of sex trafficking, because not only do they deal with the stigma of selling their bodies, They often manage drug addictions. People would honestly be floored if they realized how many people were addicted to chemicals that they were forcibly given. Story 9. I feel like a lot of the comments saying that they never judge their clients might be working in voluntary services or they have been very fortunate in their client base. Judgment is not an inherently bad thing. It is how we know that murdering people is wrong. So when a convicted pedophile client told me, "Nothing gets me going like a pair of little girls' worn panties," you better believe I judged him. I continued to work with him and I treated him with compassion and respect because he is a human being worthy of both. I did my job because I am a professional. But I cannot honestly say that I did not judge him. I judged that he should never be around children. I judged that he is not yet ready for change. I judged that his access to his own daughter should be closely supervised. That is a lot of judgments. Understanding your own inherent biases and how they influence your work is a very important part of training and practice. Story 10. Here's my most recent one. As the pandemic worsened here in the United States and more lockdowns are on their way, one of my most extroverted clients and I brainstormed ways to meet her social needs while remaining safe. The following week, she canceled her session and told me that she's positive for COVID-19 after attending an orgy, which definitely wasn't one of our ideas. I let out the deepest, most defeated sigh after I hung up the phone. Story 11. Lots of people discussing pedophilia as an example of the toughest stuff to not judge despite our training. I haven't yet treated a pedophile, thankfully. At least not an identified one. I did run a men's anger management group, though, and some of those men had done some terrible things to women. Most of them I found ways to like and admire for their positive aspects, but there were two guys in that group I just could never find unconditional positive regard for. One guy basically never spoke in the group. He would give one-word answers and occasionally just discuss how unfair the system was to him. I worked really hard to open him up and find things to connect over, but he never opened up to me or the group. He left the group after he strangled his girlfriend and went to jail. She survived, thankfully. The other left the group early routinely, showed up late, participated minimally, and similarly never wanted to open up honestly. He left early one group after we had discussed him staying to the end and threatened me when I told him he wasn't going to get credit for attendance, something the court required. Oddly, I eventually moved into the apartment below him completely without knowledge and listened to him scream at his girlfriend and break things while I called the cops. I judge these men. They're terrible. Maybe they're redeemable, but redemption requires self-exploration and they both refused to do so. It's worth noting how differently I felt about them than so many others in the group. Men I found ways to help, admire, and respect even in spite of their awful behavior in the past. Story 12. I joined in a review of a secluded patient, and he threw a cup of urine and feces in my face when we opened the door. I tried to be objective about his experience, but I just thought, what a terrible person. I work in inpatient services, so it can be hard to challenge myself at times. Individuals with a diagnosis of personality disorder, for example, can do things that in isolation make you think they're just being difficult or manipulative. However, considering the experiences that shape them to react like that in a given situation can help to clear my judgment and find compassion. It's harder when someone bites me or hits me with one of our detachable anti-ligature curtain poles. Though. Story 13. I work with youth and adolescents who have anxiety, trauma, and/or depression. Some of the kids I worked with had severe attachment issues. Regardless, I never thought I'd have to seriously explain, 1. You can't just buy a straitjacket for your kid. Feeding your kid ultra-spicy ramen each night instead of the meal everyone else is eating isn't specifically defined as abuse, but you have to understand the emotional abuse that this causes. Your kid isn't trying to kill you because they stand in your doorway at night crying. That's likely because they're scared of their traumatic nightmares but feel like you will just yell at them if they wake you up. Thank you all for your questions and support. This case has really helped to shape my approach to therapy and has highlighted the importance of healthy communication between parents and kids. My number one tip: don't let someone else tell you how you feel or think. If someone says, "You're angry with me," or something to that effect, ask yourself if you really are. If you're not actually angry, then don't spend a second more on it. A lot of kids or family members get hung up on trying to justify their own actions according to someone else's perception. Story 14, therapist here. I don't think I have ever judged clients. My job is to understand them and their experiences and help them make the improvements they are ready to make. But I have made my thoughts clear about choices, especially choices parents make for or about their kids. This probably comes off as judgment, depending on the client's insecurity about the topic. One example was telling parents of a child I was working with who had a severe mood disorder and had made both suicidal and homicidal threats and attempts, that it did not seem like a good idea to buy the young kid a gun, especially the week after the mother spent the session sharing her fears that the child would murder her. Story 15. Clinical psychologist working primarily in forensics here. This means my clients are usually involved in legal proceedings, such as family court, juvenile court, and criminal court. My job is usually to evaluate or provide treatment. I'm not there to judge. That's the judge's job, but of course, I have my thoughts. I am usually impressed by the justifications people make for bad behavior. The one that irks me the most is when parents manipulate their child against the other parent. I've had to do therapy for a 5-year-old who said she doesn't want to see a parent because they haven't paid child support. Excuse me? What 5-year-old knows, understands, or needs to be worried about child support? Story 16. Opposite side, if that's accepted too. I was assigned to see the lead psychologist of the local hospital as I was severely depressed and had become suicidal. She literally rolled her eyes at me, told me to grow up, and said she could be having appointments with people who were actually about to kill themselves, not me who was already working with the team. This sent me absolutely spinning, bottling everything up, thinking I didn't deserve help, and I ended up in the hospital 2 years later after an attempt. When they looked at my records, the hospital suddenly became very interested in any psychological experts I'd previously spoken to. I informed them of the above incident. They asked if I knew the name, and I said I didn't, but they had a strong accent. They immediately looked like they were about to burst out crying, apologized excessively, then informed me they had been fired a year ago. No idea how many people were affected by that therapist. Story 17. You mentioned you're getting ready to start therapy. I know we're different, but therapy was one of the best decisions I ever made for myself. It's good to have a neutral third-party weigh in on what troubles you. And remember, you don't have to stay with a therapist if you don't want to. Therapy, like any psychological treatment, is often more about trial and error to find what works for the individual than anything. Also, you'll get out of it what you put in, so be upfront, frank, and honest with your therapist. That will help them work with you on determining the best therapy course for you. I wish you the best of luck. Story 18. When I was underage, I got caught with a drink on Bourbon Street and received a minor in possession charge. I was telling my therapist about it and said that the police caught me with a hand grenade in New Orleans. He didn't realize that a hand grenade was a type of drink, and it was funny to watch him try to process that his patient might have just casually told him he had been caught with an explosive grenade. He took a long pause and said, "Where did you even find a grenade?" I realized the misunderstanding quickly and corrected him. But for a moment, he definitely was thinking, how do I deal with this? Story 19. Well, I quit my last therapist because I made him cry uncontrollably. He tried not to, but he just couldn't hold it back. I felt guilty and won't see him anymore. I think he may have lost a child before. I described watching my aunt grieve over her son's body. I felt so much pain losing him, but was explaining how watching my aunt was dramatically worse. The details about her are what made him lose it. I could tell he was reliving something inside his own head. Story 20. When you, as a therapist, get to that point, it's time to start thinking of referrals. Be genuine with your client and then refer out. You have to have unconditional positive regard, or you'll never achieve therapeutic rapport. I think, for me, the one that comes to mind is a frequent caller to the suicide hotlines. He would call in and say he's not providing his phone number or name. He would just say that you had 10 seconds to convince him not to kill himself over the phone, or he would harm himself and it would be your fault. Then he would count down from 10 to 1 while you're on the phone talking. At 1, he'd hang up. I'm sure the whole point was to make me feel bad or prove some point. I don't know. I have insufficient information to make an assessment with just that. But I have to admit, When I was trying to sleep on days he'd call, especially the first time, I was thinking, this person better not be dead. Story 21. In this thread, too many responsible professionals. I came here to read the salacious stories of how some doctors went overboard on patients and lost their certifications. Instead, all I've gained is even more respect than I already had for the backbreaking and sometimes thankless hard work these individuals do every day. Work I could never do, not with any consistency anyway. Responsible individuals.